All right, hello everyone, and welcome. It is Thursday, December 10th, on the second half of week 3. And again, we have a new round of information here. We've got a number of different topics to get into. On Tuesday, we discussed your new week 3 assignments. We went over your game composition, which was the Palace of Orinthalion game project, and went through a couple of different ideas about how the music was going to be set up, specifically the idea or concept of vertical layering, where your music is layered on top of one wave file on top of the next, and they all have the possibility of playing together at the same time. So we will dive into some of these details a bit more on the concept of how horizontal music and vertical music will work in different types of games. We'll also talk about the concept of game states, where you have different changes in the game. At every moment in the game, at every millisecond, something is happening, and there is the possibility for change in all the time in the game, and your music has to react to that. And so we can identify where those changes are going to happen, or where those different game states will happen, and make sure that we have the correct piece of music playing at that time to create the overall soundtrack that we want to hear. So really our topics are going to be getting into how the music is actually used in the game. Over time, while working on a project, you will be building more and more musical assets that get into you typically have a folder structure or some sort of organization that grows and grows over time as you fill it with more and more music that is identified for different parts of the game. And typically the music starts out and composed in a just more of a linear format, and over time, as the game becomes more clear and the different music requirements or the needs for the music becomes more identifiable, you kind of flag different pieces of music to go into the different parts or slots in the game. So now we are going to kind of towards the second half of the month talk about how the music is actually working in the game, different technical approaches of how the music and game interact with each other, what actually happens to your wave files to set them up so that the game properly triggers the correct wave file at the correct time, and it basically stitches the whole musical soundtrack together. Over our different projects, we've certainly identified different ways that the music is going to be set up. You created and composed different musical cues with the intention of it being used in a particular way. In 2D platformer, we really focused on the idea of intro, main loop, and ending. In Angry Bots, it is the concepts of ambient and action and stingers and how they all work together. It's still all wave files, but certainly used in different ways. And then the Palace composition for this week is the vertical layered approach. And so our discussion will now, we understand the concepts of how these things will work, but our discussion will head towards how it is actually functioning and used by the game itself. So that's some of the topics that we will dive into this evening. Let me see where we are at with the assignments. The assignments are rolling back towards you, and we have another round of revisions this week for your Week 2 Angry Bots composition, your 2D platformer technical assignment, and your chiptune production technique. So those will open up, and you have an opportunity to submit those by the end of the week. And we will keep rolling through Into week 4, like I said, our Palace composition is our final full game composition. There is a new composition in week 4, but it's not attached directly to a game project because we don't have a week 5 to do the revisions. And we have a nice holiday coming up here, a nice break. So we will kind of be able to smoothly enter and kind of wrap everything up for the month there in week 4. So that's our assignment submitted, the revision opportunity coming up here. In week 4, you will have one more opportunity for revision of your week 3 assignments. And yeah, that will kind of set up the pace for the rest of the month. All right, so let's get into some of the topics here, some of the concepts that we want to identify for our discussion for this evening. Starting out here with some of the functions of game music and identifying what purpose it's actually serving for our game. These next couple of ideas here are really a really solid checklist to go through as you are continuing to develop all of the music for the game. If ever you are running short of ideas, or you want to make sure that you've hit on all of the different directions your music soundtrack can take, well, here is a list of some really core functionality of what your music is doing for you. So you might be able to, certainly this is not an exhaustive list of all of the different approaches and uses for music in games, but it's certainly a good list to start with to identify any gaps that might be in there. So one of the most straightforward and fundamental functions of our music soundtrack, and this holds true for games, but certainly has its history and roots in film and television and stage and theater, where music is really there to direct to the emotional feelings of the audience. Sound effects are really kind of the facts telling you what is going on around you or in the film or in the game. Dialogue is telling the story and the lines of the character, and so the music is there to really tell you the emotional context of all of the rest of the informational sounds. So this is pretty much square one for a music soundtrack, and there's certainly a lot of other points that the soundtrack can fill over time. So these are all pulled from your textbook this month, where you can find a really solid description and more detail on each one of these concepts. And these, beyond the emotional qualities of your music soundtrack, these next couple of ideas really reflect more of your music serving a game project or a game environment. So, music as a state of mind. You really want to draw your focus and attention, or draw the player's focus and attention into the game as quickly and readily as possible, so that they really feel more attached to the project, feel more attached to the music and the soundtrack, and really puts you in that kind of virtual cone or zone where you are directly attached to, or have a sense of being more directly attached to the game. Certainly the visuals are there to direct that, but the music can do it very, very easily, where it gives you a sense of the pacing and the rhythm of the game. You can do this very, very easily with repetitious music to draw them in, and either you want to not complete repetition, not just something without any sort of development or change, just something that's completely static. You want to certainly watch out for that concept, but repetition and development and evolving will give them a place to start and move further and further into the sense of the game. So this works very, very well for music. However, repetition in sound effects can really kill the overall sense of contact or believability in the game, because sounds in the real world, while music can be repetitious quite easily, sounds in the real world are not the exact same sound over and over again, unless it's created by a machine or a computer. The sounds in the natural world always have very small differences in volume and timbre and pitch. And so a direct recording of a sound that's repeated over and over again can become very, very robotic and synthetic sounding. So beyond music as a state of mind, our next one here gets into music as a world builder, where you are creating, once you've drawn the player into the game, or in the process of drawing them deeper and deeper into the game, creating the world that surrounds them, the environment that the game is, the story that takes place in, being immersed into the world and being able to quickly identify what's going on around you, where you are in the world, and when you are in time or in history. And this, you can certainly do this through the visuals, but very, very quickly give a player a sense of where they are, even before the visuals turn on, by having a bit of music and sounds to establish the environment that they are in. So, and this is this animation here is from a recent demonstration of Microsoft's HoloLens, which a lot of companies are getting into virtual reality and augmented reality in different formats, just a different level of everything. But it just adds a new twist of immersion overall, where sound has done, and we've had the technology for quite a while, where sound has been able to create an immersive environment very easily. Whether it's headphones or whether it's a surround sound system, you can immerse the player in directional sound all around them quite easily. And this hasn't really been done in the same way with visuals. Now everybody's got to wear silly helmets on their heads and have computer screens plugged directly into their eyes, but it provides for another level of immersion and enjoyment into the game. And so music and sound can bring the player there very quickly, because you can trick the ears better, easier than you can trick the eyes. Music as a pace setter. Music is very good at this. This is a fundamental aspect of our music, which is the pace, the rhythm, the tempo. You can kind of speed up or slow down the overall pacing of your game through your music. Racing games are a really good example of this. Puzzle games do this really well. There are other aspects of certain types of games, like running out of time or having a power-up that lasts a certain amount of time, where you can change the music. If you have a power-up and for the next 20 seconds you are invincible and you can cause all sorts of havoc, well, change the music up, bring up the pace, maybe go double time, and completely change the vibe of the music. And then once that power-up runs out, you can switch back down to the more consistent tempo. Super Mario Brothers did this very nicely. After I think it was about 200 seconds left in the particular level, the music speeds up. Also, if you get one of the invincible stars, where you start blinking and you can run through the game map and have incur no damage, then you have different musical cues that indicate to the player very, very quickly, readily, what needs to happen, that they need to hurry up. Music as an audience. Often games are, often the music for a game is reacting to what the player is doing almost in the way that an audience will applaud or boo or cheer or gasp or laugh or whatever group emotion it might be. But the music is reacting to what the player is doing and congratulating the player with a nice little musical flourish or a couple of notes that says, "Oh, you've done something correct. You've done something well," or gives them a bad sound effect when they screw up. When you are winning, there's typically a music changes in the direction, maybe more of a major key and a heroic feel to it, versus the negative direction. You often have winning or losing in a game, and the music will reflect all of that. This happens very most straightforward example would be puzzle games or timed games, where it's not necessarily a puzzle, but you have to do something, maybe like singing games or dancing games or music instrument games. Rock Band and Guitar Hero do this very, very well. When you're actually performing in front of an audience, or at least that's the concept in the game, it's a direct correlation to that. So the music is often there to reflect the ups and downs of what's going on in the game and give information to the player and push them in the correct direction. And so if you can identify those kind of forks in the road or in the story where you say, well, if they go down this path, maybe it's a good path, and if they go down this path, then it's a bad path, and we have a particular piece of music at that fork in the road, or actually two pieces of music that reflect those different choices. So that is a common approach to the music and how the soundtrack can act as an audience. With every single change and with every split or branching of the tree of the storyline, you have different pieces of music that reflect all of those different choices. It can become very reactive to everything that goes on and all the choices made by the player. Music as branding. This is a very, very necessary aspect to your music soundtrack. Sometimes it's done more intentionally than others. The branding of your music soundtrack is when your music becomes so identifiable with the game project that even separately, your music reminds the consumer of the game. The game reminds the consumer of your music. They are mutually connected together. And this often comes from the repetition again, where the player is going to hear the same piece of music over and over again as they play through the game. It becomes very, very identifiable. A lot of times this is your intention, where you want very catchy pieces of music that exist in their own right, attached to the game or not. Certainly early game soundtracks had to rely on this, where they didn't have much space for expansive soundtracks, so you had to make sure that the music that you included used every byte as efficiently as possible to create memorable pieces of music. Also, if you don't have a very big music soundtrack, you hear the same pieces of music over and over again, and just often by the nature of repetition, you get attached to them. Music as demarcation. This is using music to identify different locations and space through the game. It might come very directly, where the player enters on one side of the screen, they're in a particular level or game screen, and they exit off of the other side of the game screen, and it goes into a new area. They walk into a building or out of a building, and the music might change according to the space that they're in. Are they in a new room? Are they in a new building, a new environment, inside or outside? Is there something in that particular room that's special that they need to pay attention to? This also goes to the idea of diegetic music or non-diegetic music, which is a concept from the film world, really, where if the music exists in the space of the game or the movie, like, does the character in the game hear the music? Is it coming from a radio? Is it playing from their car radio? Are they watching TV or a movie in the TV or movie or game? Then it is diegetic music. Diegetic music, and it exists for the sake of the story and the character. Non-diegetic music is most soundtrack music. It's really what we're most accustomed to hearing in a soundtrack for a movie or for a video game, where non-diegetic music only exists for the player, the consumer, the human listening to the game or the movie. Most of the time, the music that you hear in a game isn't actually heard by the character in the game. And so this gives a very separate space for the music to exist in. And so if you can use your music to set up different locations, different areas, and different spaces in the game, you can certainly use it to your advantage. You can start identifying how much music you need and where does it all go in the game. And immersion, a very useful function of music, and kind of touched on in a couple of the other categories, where your music is really meant to give the player a sense of location, a sense of space, and to draw them into the game world and get them lost in the game, separate from the world that they actually are in, right? You don't want them to feel like they're sitting on their couch. You want the music to be epic and grand, so that the player feels like they are actually engaged in battle with all of these huge robots and monsters. This is the sense where all the lights are out in the room, and you're playing the horror game after midnight, and somebody comes in and turns on the lights, and you throw the controller across the room and get freaked out because you are so much in the zone or drawn into the game. Music can do that. The sound effects can do that, where you are not thinking so much about watching a screen, listening to speakers, and pressing buttons on a controller. You are just completely immersed in the game world, and that sometimes can be sometimes can be easy to do, right? The nature of music itself can draw somebody in, but you're really some of the challenge can sometimes lie in maintaining that. So you don't want any sort of anything to drop out or pop or click or repeat, or levels are messed up, and any sort of technical issues to get in the way of the creativity and the suspension of disbelief, where you feel like you're drawn in. As soon as it sounds like a computer playing a video game, well, you lose a bit of that. All right. So our next topic here, right about here, we are going to talk about some of the limitations that can be incurred from the technical side of things. We're going to move more into the technical space here. And we are going to talk about some of the limitations first so we can understand a bit more completely why some of the techniques are used in getting your music to actually function in the game. And this limited resources discussion is really when reality hits of working in a game project separate than a music project or film. Creating music in your DAW, recording WAV files, loading up plugins, loading up synths, and there's a lot of technology going on there. And over the years, our computers have gotten better, and we have faster processors and more RAM and larger hard drives, which allow us to have more tracks inside of our DAW session, more synths loaded up, more plugins, more stuff going on. And it is certainly not beyond the technical restrictions of your computer to have an audio session that has 24-bit 96 audio files, 24-bit 96 kilohertz audio files recorded. You can have 100 tracks or more. You can have lots of plugins loaded up simultaneously. And depending on how much you have set up, maybe your computer doesn't even sweat it. So you can very quickly, and then even when you bounce out the files, then it really doesn't, once you render out the final WAV file, the WAV file probably, at least for playback, isn't all that big. And it's just plays back very nicely and efficiently on your computer. So what ends up happening sometimes is you take your wonderfully high resolution audio WAV file and you send it off to the developer and you say, look how big and high resolution this audio file is. Doesn't it sound great in my 10-minute epic long composition? And they say, wow, that's really, really cool. We really like that piece of music, and we really like how it sounds. The only problem is you got to fit it in a space that's like this big in our Android app download or in our iOS, iPhone, or iPad download, right? So you have to make a larger file, or maybe it's not just one piece of music, but you have an hour or 2 or 5 or 10 or more hours worth of music that you need to fit on a game disc along with everything else. So there are some limitations in how much audio can, how large your audio files can be in playback. Now, we, in past year or more, I don't know, it's been about 2 years now, about 2 Christmases ago, the PlayStation 4 came out, Xbox One comes out, a Mac and a PC has lots of RAM, lots of hard drive space. So these kind of devices, there's a little bit less of accountability, well, I don't want to say that, less restrictions on the resources. You have fast processors, large RAM, large hard drive spaces. So a little bit less there, but if you go into the domain of internet games or web platform games, social media games, mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, iOS, Android, those kind of that audience out there, then the technology is much smaller. I mean, you have much smaller downloads for these games overall. And so we have to take into account the availability of resources. So we're going to talk about a couple of these different ideas. The first one is RAM. Limited amount of RAM available. My computer has 16 gigabytes worth of RAM on it. You might have 4 or 8 or 12 or 16. The new systems, your PS4 and the Xbox One, each have 8 gigabytes worth of RAM in them, which is a whole lot because the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 had only 512 megabytes worth of RAM, or one half a gigabyte compared to 8 gigabytes now. So they had 16 times the amount of RAM going from the PS3 to PS4 and Xbox 360 to Xbox One. So that is a whole lot more space to play in. But consider that any audio file that needs to be heard immediately needs to be loaded up into RAM. So if you need to hit that button and you need to hear the jump sound or the punch sound or the gunshot fire, or you need to hear a sound immediately, you need to hear footsteps or a door opening, or most of the time sound effects, a lot of those sound effects need to be loaded up into RAM so that they can be played as soon as needed. Music, sometimes you can get away with having less sync in the music. So if a music file plays 100 milliseconds later or even a half second later, sometimes that's okay. If you need the music cue to hit perfectly on sync, sometimes they will load up the first second or 3 or 5 seconds of the audio file into RAM, and then constantly switch and rotate out each of the new parts. There's lots of different ways that this all happens in real time. It's the same sort of concept of loading up a whole bunch of instances of contact and a whole lot of different sample libraries loaded simultaneously, and you can start quickly running out of RAM, because all of those sounds, if you need to hit a key and hear it immediately, then those sounds need to be loaded into RAM. So whenever you're loading up a game, newer games are a bit better at this and kind of do this a bit more invisibly, but for a long time and still, games, if you go to a new level and it says loading, it's unloading all of the old audio and music and graphics from the previous level, unloading those and loading all of the new stuff into RAM so that it's ready to go. So you might consider how much RAM is available. Maybe your music, if it doesn't need to be completely in sync, then you don't necessarily need to consider the RAM limitations. But if it needs to be played immediately, then there's only so much RAM available. And you certainly don't get the full 8 gigabytes. There's graphics and the whole rest of the game that takes up a lot of that. Typically you get about 10% of the overall resources. That's a very general number, and it certainly could be more or less than that. But that's sometimes a good number to start with, where you get 10% of the RAM, or you get 10% of the processing power, or, well, maybe not 10% of the disk space, because one of, I don't want to say issues, but one of the realities of our audio files, whether it's sound effects or music, especially music, our audio files are big, fat audio files. They take up a whole lot of space, especially music, because it's a consistent 5-minute long audio file that's doing nothing except for taking up space. So the general specification for a WAV file, for every mono minute of CD quality audio, so that is 16-bit 44.1 mono for 1 minute, is 5 megabytes. And 5 megabytes, you can use that up very, very quickly, right? So that means for a stereo file, it's 10 megabytes. So 10 megabytes for every minute of stereo music, you can very, very quickly eat up a whole bunch of hard drive space or disk space. Now, games are getting exponentially big all of the time, right? Back in the day, where everything was on a Nintendo cartridge, the cartridges were somewhere between a couple of 100 kilobytes to, I think at the most was a 4 megabyte cartridge, but they were just they were big if they were a couple of megabytes. And then we got CD-based technology, so we were at 650 megabytes. Then game systems went to DVDs, then went to 4.9 gigabytes, and now we are at Blu-ray discs where we have 50 gigabytes. Games can easily be many 10 or 20 or 40 or 50 or more gigabytes of space. And so your audio can occupy that. But again, if you're a download, if you are doing a mobile game, then you don't necessarily have that large amount of space available, and you have to make amends. A good example of this, the game Halo 3 was released for the Xbox 360, and it was on a DVD. The DVD is about 4.9 gigabytes, let's say about 5 gigabytes. And when they created all of the audio for the game, all of the music, sound effects, and dialogue, and everything was complete and approved, all of that audio came in at 9 gigabytes. So twice as much as the entire game should be, they just had the audio. So on the Xbox from Microsoft, they do have a compression algorithm, like data compression, like just kind of sort of like an MP3 file where you lose some quality of the file, lose some resolution, but you have great reductions in the file size. So they chose a 10-to-1 ratio for their audio files, and it reduced those 9 gigabytes basically down to around 1 gigabyte. And they had 3 gigabytes left over for the rest of the game. So now they have enough space for everything involved. But it is a very big consideration for our music. And then another consideration here would be a limited audio system. This is just a reality of the consumers and the audience and our music. It may be true that your music will never be heard in a better space than your studio, meaning that you would hope that everybody has some amazing surround sound home theater system that they have their consoles hooked up to, or some amazing studio monitor speakers for their computer. But more than likely, they are listening and playing your game on a TV, listening out of the TV speaker, or they have a pair of low-end computer speakers, or they're listening to it on headphones or earbuds, and they may not get the full resolution of your audio mix. Games do have the ability to change the mix in real time to account for different monitoring sources. So a lot of games, if you go into the options, you can choose or you can indicate that you are listening on headphones or earbuds or stereo speakers or surround sound speakers, and the game will change the mix, frequency, and panning all in real time to account for that. So games can often operate as 5.1 or stereo or mono, and can be changed, and that means you need to create multiple mixes for all of those games or all those speaker setups. And most of the time that you consider and you mix according to these different the monitoring situations, but rarely does it affect your overall composition. Maybe something to consider is if you are doing a mobile game that's going to be on a handheld or tablet, and they're either going to be listening out of their little speaker or maybe some earbuds, then maybe you don't want to have a soundtrack that is completely just a whole bunch of bass, really deep low end. You might want to have more content in the higher registers that are more easily heard on these types of speakers. So just considerations as you are composing your music. All right, so different functions of our music. We discussed different limitations of or realities of dealing with music for games. And let's talk about how the music actually works in a game, how the WAV file is used in different approaches, and a lot of these concepts we've already touched on in our different games, our different soundtracks, but we'll go into more detail of what is actually going on in different uses for it and how it ties together with the gameplay. But before I do that, let me go ahead and take a quick pause. If you have any questions, go ahead and post those up. I'll be back in just a sec. All right. So, next one here. Actually, really where we want to start out with different approaches for your music to function in game. We want to start with the most fundamental approach, which is a linear loop. Actually, I think probably maybe even more base than that would be just a piece of linear music that starts at the beginning and plays through and stops at the end. And that would be more of a static piece of music that doesn't change. The game doesn't interact with it more than just starting it and stopping it. So if you want to have any sort of interactivity or functionality between your music and the game, that typically starts with a loop. And a loop is best used when you have less of an idea of how long something is going to take. Where your player can just sit in a loop for as long as necessary until they complete a particular action, and then the music can move on, transitioning into either a piece of music that plays once or into another loop. Now, the loops that we create for our games, each one of our projects each week, they are pretty short loops. Even the ambient cue, which is the longest one at around a minute, is relatively short for a full game experience. Levels and gameplay can easily last for many, many minutes and extend for longer periods of gameplay overall. And this means longer loops will allow for less repetition. Games can easily have loops that last minutes, even 5 or 10 minutes long, so that you can reduce repetition as much as possible. And maybe the game can start and stop that loop in different places so as to give some variation whenever it's heard. So our loops are not really the best example of the types of loops that are used in a game. If the shorter the loop is, the more you have to switch between multiple loops to be able to provide any sort of development in the soundtrack. And really the goal is to lose the player in the piece of music so that they can't identify when the loop starts or stops or begins or ends, really. And it should kind of feel like it's perfectly fine if it just continues on and never ends. Periods of long exploration, loops that are heard while the level is going on, or solving a puzzle are really common uses for a linear loop. Some games utilize the concept of a board switch, which means if I'm about to hear that loop play one more time, then it's going to start getting boring, and I don't want to get bored with that piece of music, and we'll just fade it out and make it go away for a little while. And then whenever the next action happens, then I'll switch to the new piece of music. Nintendo games were always good at this, or are always good at this, where if you're just lost and roaming around and you have a 3 or 4 minute long piece of music and it goes through it once, it'll play it again twice, maybe it'll play it again third time, but as it goes into the fourth time, the game says, okay, we don't want this to get repetitive, so what we'll do is we'll just gracefully fade it away, and the player can just take their sweet time to figure out exactly how to get to the next part of the story, and then they trigger whatever the change is, move on to the next part of the story, and then the new music swells in like it should. So even with longer loops, there are considerations that repeating a loop over and over again can make it sound, can get very annoying very quickly. There are all sorts of different techniques for creating loops, and our production technique in the first week went through a couple of different editing techniques where the music already exists, and you need to create and edit the audio to create a seamless loop. There is a really good metaphor? Is that the word I want to use? There's a really good imagery, let's put it that way. There's good imagery in the text when describing a linear loop where somebody is walking down a circular path, and they enter into this path and they walk through, let's say they're walking through on the path through the garden, and they will eventually come around to the place they started, but you want different identifiable things, the trees and the grass and the flowers and the signposts along this path. You want to make those as invisible as possible or as seamless as possible, so you don't draw any sort of attention to the fact that you've gone around this path more and more over and over again. So you want to remove any sort of identifiable elements of your music that can really give away the fact that you have a loop. This comes in its first form certainly from the composition itself. So while we use loops a whole lot in game music, that does not mean looping does not necessarily mean repetitious or boring. You can have lots of change and development and very little repetition through a 3-minute long piece of music. But by the nature of it being a loop, it will repeat over again. And so while within the context or within the time frame of the music, the beginning to end, you want it to be as least repetitive as possible, as little repetition as possible, to remove those signposts, to make it so you don't make it so obvious where the loop happens. Your choice of instrumentation. Sometimes you can hide loops in either changes of instrumentation. Things that are more percussive can often hide where the loop points stop and start over again. Sometimes you can use a crash symbol to hide the loop, although somebody who is really observant might identify, oh, every time I hear that crash, it seems like the music starts over again. Sometimes you can get away with fades. You probably want to avoid fading completely to silence and fading back up because that's really obvious. But if you build build instrumentation, you build more and more parts into the music, and it fades up in overall complexity, then maybe you want to fade it back down, fade out some instruments, bring it back down its overall intensity and pacing to return back to a more of a base level, and then it can rise and fall over the course of the loop. Well, I mentioned rhythmic, hiding your loops and transitions at rhythmic points can often make for an easier loop than trying to hide it in something that is a big, long pad that constantly is morphing and changing over time. There's really not a solid, like a downbeat of a rhythmic loop makes a really easy place for an edit to place an edit versus something that's constantly changing over time without any real identifiable points. Effects. Sometimes you can get away with effects. This is kind of a, I mean, I guess you could be really really creative with it, but sometimes this is can be kind of a cheap method of doing a loop where the music is going, you got drums and bass and melody and harmony, and all of those elements kind of fade off and go into a whole bunch of weird effects that swirl around, big reverbs, delays. Sometimes DJs will do this where they'll just go off and fade into a whole bunch of weird sounds and effects so that they can switch from one tempo to the next. And so sometimes you can hide transitions in effects changes. Big reverb hits or big delay hits can work well here. And then we saw a whole bunch of different editing techniques from our assignment in the first week, where we did things like doubled the length of a particular piece of music, bounced it twice as long, chopped off the first half and only used the second half to create seamless transitions. We took a audio file, chopped it in half, and flipped the two sides to create a seamless loop. So there are different approaches, and this can be a very common approach in games where the music is created in a more linear format, and then you have to go back and edit it in a way where you can make it loop. You can create some solid loops from it. This also can be the composer going back to the original session and bouncing out different stems, making sure those stems loop on their own, work together, and can be recombined together by the game. So a linear loop is very useful, a very common technique for games, and probably the most consistent use and technique for your music in a game would be the combination of looping pieces of music and one-shot single phrase piece of music that exists for a particular amount of time. Meaning that there are some music that's just going to loop, and if you don't have any clue how long something is going to take, then create a loop so that the player can be there for as long as needed. But certain events in a game are very specifically timed to an animation. There's a timer in the game. There's a certain sequence of events that need to happen, and the music needs to follow that. Well, then those will happen and are played through in sequence at one at a time, also known as one-shots, because they only play once. They do not loop. So a type of one-shot is a stinger. And a stinger is played to... it's typically used as emphasis. It is often used to hide a transition or hide something in the music soundtrack to kind of say, hey, look over here, look at the monkey, while the music switches over to something else, right? look at the flashing birdie, and then here, listen to the stinger, and then we'll switch over to a new piece of music. So there might be a looping piece of music, a piece of exploration music, for as long as it needs, for as long as the player takes to find that secret object. And once they find the secret object to move forward in the story, they're going to play, the game's going to play a stinger. They're going to hear a little musical flourish, a couple of notes, something that probably goes in a positive direction that congratulates the player, that says, hey, good job, you just found the next piece of the puzzle. Now you can continue on with the story. Stingers they're often musical, and really for our purposes, when we're talking about music composition, talking about the music soundtrack, we're often relating them in more of a musical context, but they can also certainly be sound design. They can be a combination of both, and are used to embellishment or used for emphasis, so that they are really there to identify that you did something, right? It's there to provide feedback, to tell the player, hey, you did something correct or you did something incorrect. Already mentioned helped hide transitions. This is our use for it in Angry Bots. We have 3 stingers. So those stingers are played along with each one of the 3 action cues. So you have a really sudden transition from the ambient cue into the action cue. The stingers are played in order to help that transition, so that it adds more change, more complexity to what's going on, so it adds more detail. Stingers, one-shots, common use for them, common places that you will find stingers in a game, puzzles. So, hey, you solved the puzzle. Congratulations. Here's a stinger. Power-ups. You get a power-up is you have more ammo or more health or more shield, or you're invincible, or you are really fast or something. And these are usually timed. For the next 20 seconds, you can go in berserk mode and cause a whole bunch of damage to the enemies. And there's a very specific piece of music that is specifically timed to the length of that power-up, and it will resolve and finish and rotate back into the original music. If you find any secrets or Easter eggs in the game, those can often be emphasized with a stinger. Different environments as you switch from one environment to the next, which often means a transition of the music, then that can often be punctuated by a stinger also. And music, sound effects to an extent, but music especially, is really tied to the changes in a game. How the game determines when a new piece of music is played is determined by changes that happen in the game. The game isn't really doing much to your music while the music is being played, right? While you're in the middle of a WAV file, the game is just playing the music back, and all of the work was done by the composer in the creation of the music, and then you bounce out a WAV file. The game isn't actually creating the music. It's not performing the music in any way. It's just playing back to the correct WAV file. So there's not much happening with the game and the music while the music is playing. The real challenge comes in, the real technique occurs in the transitions or the changes from one piece of music to the next. So that's where most of the thought comes in. It's where do those changes happen? What piece of music plays? How do we get from one piece of music to the next? How do we go from, is it either the same tempo and the same key and then it's a little bit easier? Or how do we move to completely new tempos, to completely new keys, maybe even new genre, new part? I mean, it's a complete switch in the story, move to a new level, a whole new soundscape or a whole new background sounds need to be heard. So it's the changes. it's moving from one piece of music to the next. And so if the changes in the game tell the game which music to play, those changes are identified as game states. This is a very common concept in all aspects of games. It's certainly not just a music thing. It controls aspects of the gameplay, of the graphics, of the programming, it's a really core fundamental aspect of what is going on in the game. Now, a game state isn't it's a concept, it's an idea. It isn't any physical thing, certainly in as much as it's a computer, nothing's physical, but it's not a piece of code, or it's not a single object in the game. A game state is a concept or an idea. It is a change in the game. And now I'm going to give a very bad definition for what a game state is. I was always taught that you don't use the words that you are trying to define in the definition of that word, right? So I have a whole bunch of English teachers that would not appreciate this, but a game state is the state the game is in at any one time. It is what is happening at any moment, at any millisecond during gameplay. Anything can happen and anything can change. So it's identifying all of the changes and what is happening at any one time. The way the game works, one fundamental function of the game is the frame rate of the game. When drawing images on the screen, it draws them at a certain frame rate. The faster your computer goes, typically the faster the frame rate is. A quality image on the screen is 30 frames per second. Kind of real high quality is about up to upwards of 60 frames per second. It can certainly go faster than that. But and some of this is based off of film, where projected or movie theater film is 24 frames per second. Television is 30 or 29.97, determined by your time code. But there is a frame rate, and frame rate in movies and television is each image that is broadcast to your screen. And then as those frames move through at 30 frames per second, it gives a smooth image and movement on the screen. So the frame rate of your game is how fast something can be drawn on the screen, and everything can be computed. So you start the game, it draws something on the screen. You play the game at, let's say, 30 frames per second or upwards of 60 frames per second. It is drawing an image on the screen. Between those 1/30th of a second, it has to compute everything that's going on in the actual gameplay. And this can be... you can kind of sort of picture this as the computer constantly asking questions of itself. Did I jump? Did I run? Did I punch? Did I shoot? Did I win? Did I complete the level? Did I solve that puzzle? And it's basically everything that's possible in the game. The game is constantly determining what is happening and going on in the game. And at some point, the answer to that question is going to be yes. Did I defeat the dragon? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, then here, play defeat dragon music. Did I solve the puzzle? Yes. Well, then play puzzle solved music. And this goes through 30 frames, 30 times per second, 60 times per second, and is constantly changing in the background. So you can basically ask any question you want at any time, and at some point the game's going to respond and say yes, and then you can change the music at that point. For example, going through 2D platformer, the game says, did I start? And it's like the game talking to itself, right? Yes, we started. Okay, play intro music. All right, is the intro music done? Yes. Then play main loop 3. All right. Have I lost all my health yet or fallen off the edge? No. Okay, well then continue playing main loop 3. Now, did I get to the end of main loop 3? All right, now play main loop 1. Now play main loop 2. And it'll just go around, and it's constantly asking, hey, did I lose all my health? Hey, did I lose all my health? At that clip of 30 frames per second. And then at some point, the game says, yes, oh, yes, you did lose all of your health. And it says, okay, well then stop playing main loop and start playing ending music. And then when that's done and the game resets, start over again playing intro. Through Angry Bots, it starts with the ambient piece of music. And then it's constantly asking itself, did the spider bot activate? Did the buzzer bot fire its weapon? And anything that can be asked, anything that can be quantified, then at some point the game says, yes, the mech bot recognized the player. All right, then switch over to mech bot music. All right, yes, the player defeated the mech bot. All right, then turn off the mech bot music or actually crossfade it over back to ambient. How that happens in the game, there is certainly the technical aspect. There is the code aspect. If somebody had to go in the game and actually set it up so that when the player loses health and it plays the correct piece of music, or and somebody has to define what a game state is. So again, reemphasize the idea that a game state isn't really anything until it's determined exactly what the question is, or what defining what the game state is going to be, and then everybody goes and does their portion of their work to make it all work and function in the game. So, for example, let's say you're doing a puzzle. You as the composer, you don't have to know anything about the code or the programming or anything like that. You know the musical concepts of how everything is going to work in the game. So you create a puzzle loop, and you know that while the puzzle is going on, that this puzzle loop music will play. And when it reaches the end, it's going to go back to the front, and it's going to loop around and around. Then you also know that the player can basically win or lose. They can solve the puzzle, or maybe time runs out and they don't solve the puzzle. So you know that there is you go off and create winmusic.wave, and you also create a piece of music called losemusic.wave. Now, the programmers, they don't have to know anything about the music. They don't have to know like music theory or writing music. They probably couldn't write you a melody. They don't have to know anything really even about the contents of that music, or maybe even the WAV files or anything like that. They probably understand the kind of the technical specs of the file, but they don't have to know anything about the music itself. All they know is when you win the game, there is going to be a WAV file that says that's called winmusic.wave. So they go into the code, and somewhere they say, if you win the game, then play winmusic.wave. They don't have to know anything about the music. You don't have to know anything about the code, but that is a game state. The game state is the state of winning. Once you have won, then there is some code that fires off that says, hey, go play winmusic.wave. And if you lose, then go play losemusic.wave. So a game state allows everybody to work together on the technical side, on the creative side, and basically establish the parameters of when a piece of music is going to play. Game states are the idea of the state of winning or the state of losing. Other game states, common ones are, you've got the highest score, or you've got 100% health, or less than 10% health. Well, if the health drops below 10%, then play this low health music. Time is running out, or you've run out of time. Those are all game states. They're very common concepts used in all sorts of different games. Every game is going to be different. Every game is going to have its own unique game states. And your music is hooked to a game state. You will often hear the idea of hooks or triggers for your music. And the thing that is hooking or triggering your music to play is the fact that it's attached to a game state. So a game state could be whatever you want. Anybody in the team can say, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if this thing could happen? And if somebody can go in and program it and you can write a piece of music for it, then bam, you have a new game state with a new piece of music. So game states are a very common, very useful concept for our games. So our last topic for this evening, let me just make sure. I think that, yeah, last topic for this evening. We want to talk about the idea of horizontal resequencing and vertical layering as an approach to your music soundtrack of how your music is going to be played back and be built. Real quick, before I get into this, let me take another quick pause and we'll come back on this topic. All right. So, getting into this topic of horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. These are particular approaches of how the music is going to work in the game. These are also approaches of how you might start from a blank DAW session and start building up your tracks so that it makes your work a bit easier as you are finishing up and bouncing everything out for the game. It's basically building everything up in your DAW so that it makes sense and functions like it would in the game. So starting out with horizontal resequencing, whenever I am mentioning this terminology, and when I start introducing these ideas, I really correlate it to tracks in your DAW session, where a good way to visualize a horizontal music system as compared to a vertical music system, whenever I say horizontal, you imagine or you picture a single stereo track in your DAW. Actually, I have Logic loaded up, don't I? Right? So I create one audio track here, and whenever I... Oops. Oh, let me do a software track so I don't have to create audio tracks, regions. You imagine a single track in your DAW, and when you have a track in your DAW, you have multiple regions. Imagine these as being different game states, and these are different musical cues, different musical files or wave files, and a horizontal music system means that they are horizontally laid out. On a single stereo track, when you play through, you only hear one at a time, right? If there's no region there, you hear nothing. The most you might get is maybe there's some overlap, there's a crossfade from one to the next, but mainly you are only hearing one file at a time. And this is the same approach as a horizontal music system in a game. Think about your previous games of 2D platformer and Angry Bots, where in 2D platformer, you only heard one file at a time. You only heard intro or main loop or ending. And as the new one started, the previous one immediately stops. Angry Bots is the same way. You hear ambient or action. You do get a crossfade every once in a while, and the stingers do play with the action cues. So those are layered a little bit, but the stingers are there more for a quick emphasis as opposed to a full piece of music playing with it. But basically you have only one file playing at a time in a horizontal music setup. So, same sort of idea here. These different colored blocks are different game states. Those game states represent a different wave file or a different piece of music. These game states are similar to something that you might see in Angry Bots or in a first-person shooter, where there's either intro or this might be ambient that's played while the player is exploring around. Action is a separate wave file that is played when you're actually battling the enemy, and it immediately switches from one to the next. If you get a power-up and you get unlimited health for the next 20 seconds, the action music will turn off and it'll immediately switch over to that power-up music, and that will play through one time, timed to the same length. At random parts, you might lose health, and you go below 10% health, so you hear a piece of music that relates to that, and eventually if you lose all of your health points, you keel over and you hear death music, and it starts all over again. And so the idea here is that individual sections can be shuffled around into any order. With each piece of music, they really feel like they come from the same song, so they're the same tempo, the same key, and they're meant to be rearranged in whatever sort of order that's necessary for the game. We have 3 different variations of intros, main loops, and endings. And so they could be shuffled around into any sort of combination to make new combinations, new variations. So the core aspects here are only one piece of music is heard at a time. So that means the entire stereo mix needs to be bounced into the file. You're going to hear drums, bass, harmony, melody, all the instrument layers. And they need to be able to be rearranged in any sort of order. So the end of any one of these cues needs to connect to the beginning of any other cue so that they could work together. A horizontal music system is more of a earlier approach to music in games, where games could only play one file at a time. So it had to be a horizontal music system, and it was just switching different and the correct piece of music in and out one at a time. If you have a better idea, if you have a more direct idea of which piece of music needs to be heard at what time, then a horizontal music system works very well, because it's sort of like musical breadcrumbs, where you throw out the correct piece of music to lead the player on from one point to the next. So you say, oh, okay, you're in the intro. Here's the intro piece of music. All right, you switch over to action, throw out the action piece of music, switch it out. The low health comes in. All right, you shuffle over to that piece of music, and you can just introduce the correct piece of music as it goes to react to the gameplay. So if you have a more linear style of gameplay, if it is kind of a Well, you start at point A and you do these actions, and then you move to point B and you have to complete this, and then move to point C and you defeat this enemy and you go to point D. If it's that sort of linear progression, or if it's in a level progression, oftentimes that lends itself more to a horizontal music system. Everything is fully mixed. Each theme replaces the one before it. At the most, you might get a crossfade every once in a while, but by default, you wait through the entire piece of music before it switches to the next. Every once in a while, you can, if it's programmed into the game might actually be able to count bars and beats and understand the tempo of the music and be able to actually beat match and beat sync different transitions from one to the next. That is a bit more complex. It takes extra either technology or code or software to make that happen. A lot of games do that, and it's a much more common technique with newer software out there. We'll talk a bit more about that as we get more into the technology next week. So, vertical layering of our music. If we said that a horizontal music system is similar to a single stereo track in our DAW, well, a vertical music system is going to be similar to a multi-track DAW session, where instead of all the music being laid out horizontally, it's instead laid out vertically. This is our approach for this week's game, where the game all of the files are the same length. They start at the same time, they end at the same time, they're going to loop all together. And they're the same key, the same tempo, so that they all match sonically together. And then all the game is doing is fading in and out to the correct piece of music. So the game is constantly playing. Oh, my super short loop here. Slow this down. There we go. And all the game has to do is fade this in and out to introduce the correct piece of music. So the benefit of this is that you can introduce any music that you want at any time that you want, because all of the pieces are playing, just most of the time they are faded all the way out or muted, and you can fade them in sync and in time with all of the rest of the music because it was always there. So it utilizes one ongoing piece of music. So, of course, this would be better if this was much, much longer overall. But it's a one long piece of music that has, instead of things horizontally laid out over time, it vertically stacks so that you can create different combinations of tracks. So instead of our different game states being laid out horizontally, they are stacked on top of each other vertically. Let me say that again. Your game states are still progressing through horizontally, but they are vertically stacking different combinations of music instruments and music tracks to create the correct piece of music. Introducing new elements matching the player's actions overall. Each new layer is faded in on top of each other, often used in open world games. So if you have less of an idea of what's going to happen in the game, meaning that there's more possibilities, the player has more control, they can go off in any sort of direction, then a vertical music system makes a bit more sense, because then you can just introduce the correct piece of music and create different combinations as necessary as you move through the storyline. So here we have a couple of different game states here that match pretty well with horror games. Horror games work very well in this vertical system because the soundtrack in a horror game is all about build and release of tension. You build up to the absolute tension peak, and then it breaks into the full action as you engage with the monster or the enemy. So there might be an ambient game state where whether the player knows it or not, they're safe at this point. The monster's nowhere around, and they hear one base level of a music track. Then proximity comes in. Actually, yeah. Proximity comes in where now the enemy is nearby. Again, the player may know it, and they're trying to avoid the enemy, or the enemy knows it and the player doesn't, and they're creeping up, about to attack. There's a point where the enemy is really, really close. So this is typically the peak of the tension. They're right around the corner. They're right about to jump out to attack the player. Or maybe the player is hiding and the monster doesn't know it, but it's right there and the player is shaking, trying to hide from the enemy. Then at some point the action breaks, where monster jumps out. This is the battle. This is where the full instrumentation happens. Full pacing, full percussion. Everything is going as fast as loud as it needs to. There might be a break where the instrumentation drops off for a moment. Maybe the player wrestles and gets away, goes and hides for a little bit more. Maybe the monster finds him again. The action breaks loose again, more action. And then eventually you either run away far enough, you get away, or you defeat the monster, and there's a cooldown phase. You can't just immediately drop back down to ambient. Can't immediately start over. So there's a cooldown phase where instrumentation leaves one at a time and returns you back down to this ambient game state. So fantasy games, horror games work very well for this type of musical approach. Each layer must work with all of the other layers. So keeping the same key and tempo will make sure that they all fit well together. And this is the idea where it becomes like a different puzzle pieces, different instrumentation, different rhythms, different melodies, harmonies that need to fit well together. And so keeping in a key and a tempo will allow you to maybe play it a little bit safer so that everything will work well together. If you do want to change key, if you do want to change tempo, and you have more time to do it, meaning that you, instead of an 8-bar loop or a 32-bar loop, you have 4-minute long loop, then having a key change or a tempo change may make sense as long as you return back to the original key and tempo before looping over again. There's a couple of different approaches for vertically layering your music. One would be additive layering, which means you add in each layer one at a time and keep all of the previous layers, so that the only way is it stacks from one, then 2 plays with 1, 3 plays with 2 and 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, all the way till 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Layers all up and plays back down. So that means you always hear the bass layer. So your first instrument layer comes in, then the second one comes in, third, fourth, fifth, and then it comes back down the same way. So at this point, you always hear the earlier cues, and it adds in one layer at a time. Another way is interchange, which means it doesn't always have to keep the previous layers, and it can create new combinations for whatever you want, right? So 1 comes in, and then 4 comes in, and then 2 comes in, and then 1 comes out, and then 5 comes in, and then 4 comes out, and then 3 comes on, and then whatever it is, it will add in more layers, and this creates even more combinations because you're not always relying on the previous ones to be playing. So you can always have any combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of them playing. So different approaches in the same context or in the same technique of vertically layering your music. So we talked a bit about this idea. The best way to approach a vertical music system is what's known as a top-down approach. And that is considering the overall composition and the fact that all of these are going to have to be playing together, and think at the large macro level before going down into the micro details of building up instrument by instrument. So top down, and let's just compare that against or contrast that against a bottom up approach, the opposite approach, where a bottom up approach is a very common way of building music, where you say, okay, I'm going to write a new piece of music. I'm going to start out with drums, and I'm going to write a kick, snare, and a hi-hat line. Write out that pattern, and now I'm going to add a bass line. Now I'm going to add some keys. Now I'm going to add a guitar line. Now I'm going to add a synth line. Now I'm going to add some brass to that. And you're adding in instrument by instrument and building the composition up from the bottom-up approach. Well, the issue with that is as you are combining so many different instrument layers, you might start running out of combinations of notes, melodic ideas, harmonic lines, different rhythmic patterns, where you only have so many notes in the key and so many subdivisions of the rhythm or of the beat to use. And so you can run out of options, run out of ideas in the compositional stage. So a top-down approach will have you starting out with just a piano patch, some sort of just one instrument, so that you can focus on the composition. Pianos work well because you have instruments in the lower range, mids, and the higher range. And so you start by establishing your chord progression. Then you determine your melodies, and you build the composition first before thinking about the instrumentation, before thinking about any of the technical aspects of the mix or bouncing or formatting, because the composition is what's going to cause the most trouble. The combination of notes and rhythms, right? Pitch and time is about the most fundamental thing of what you're doing in composition. You are choosing which pitch is going to play, or which combinations of pitches are going to be playing at any one particular point in time. So thinking about the composition first will allow you to add in all of the instrumentation you need. Then you have the foundation of your chord progression. You have your different melodic lines, and you know they're all going to fit together. Now you can choose what instrument plays which part, plays which line or which melody, and you know they're always going to fit together because they all you considered the composition first. You considered the key that it was in, the tempo, the time signature, the rhythmic pattern, the chord progression, all of the fundamentals of your composition before you even approached the orchestration of it, determining which instruments plays which notes and which ones work together and how do they loop. All of that can be secondary to the composition itself. All right, so lots of different ideas, lots of different musical approaches in a game. We talked about some of the functionality of the music, some of the limitations and the restrictions of the music system in games. We talked about different musical approaches of linear loops, stingers and one-shots, and game states and how those function with your different musical cues, and then the ideas of a horizontal or vertical music system and how your music is actually working in the game. So next week, our topics will turn to the technology, some of the software that is used to actually get your music functioning in the game, some of the techniques and workflow of how your soundtrack is actually completed in the game. And then we'll also talk about how to get started in the industry, how to take what you've learned throughout the month and apply it to your portfolio, where do you find clients and projects to work on, and how do you get a foot in the door. So that will wrap it up for this evening. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and post those up, and we can address those. But other than that, have a good weekend, and I will see you again on Tuesday. Thanks a lot.